In today's episode of Afghanistan, I get to speak with Tim Anderson, one of my favorite regular guests to the show now. Tim is a journalist and academic known for his critical views of Western foreign policy in relation to West Asia and Latin America. In Syria, the USA, Israel and Turkey have finally been able to overthrow the Assad government. HTS, a universally recognized terrorist group backed by these countries, seems to be ready to form a new government. With all of this unfolding in front of our very eyes, it's very difficult not to be disheartened and depressed. The main takeaway I got from Tim in this discussion is that although the resistance has been dealt a severe blow, it is by no means knocked out. I hope you find this discussion as informative and engaging as I did. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. And now let's get started. Tim, hello. Thank you for joining us. How are you?
Hi, Tafim. Good to see you.
Good. Yeah, Tim. Tim, I think we spoke, it seems like just 2 or 3 weeks ago, and you kindly explained in great detail politics surrounding Syria. I've got a feeling that maybe we jinxed everything because at that time no one was really talking about Syria, and now everything's changed. So please, could you just talk us through where we are now?
Well, yesterday, the 8th of December, there was a terrible US-backed terrorist takeover of the whole of Syria, basically. And that followed, on the one hand, an invasion of HTS, which used to be Jabhat al-Nusra, al-Qaeda terrorists supported by Turkey from the north, but was met by a complete collapse, basically an ordered collapse of the Syrian army. So there was no substantial fighting. The first attack was on Aleppo, but then the cities of Hama and Homs, and then Damascus fell very rapidly. Obviously there was an order from the Syrian side to retreat, and there are some theories circulating about what that was about now, but obviously in part to prevent bloodshed. But basically there was almost a bloodless takeover, except that now there's a lot of shooting and some bombing in the capital, Damascus, and the government surrendered. The president left the country. No one really expected it to happen this quickly, basically. And of course, hot on the heels of that, I should add, just hours before the assault on Aleppo from the north, there was the ceasefire in Lebanon. And after the ceasefire in Lebanon, Netanyahu, the Israeli leader, said he was going to turn his attention to Syria, and was warning President Assad that he would be playing with fire, if he resisted what the Israelis wanted. And really what the Israelis had always wanted was to eliminate Syria as a key link between the Palestinian and Lebanese resistance and Iran, because it's well known that Syria was not just a conduit, but also a manufacturer of many of the weapons used by Hezbollah and the Palestinians, and getting them into occupied Palestine through various means.
Yes.
So effectively, in a very short time, the Israelis got what they wanted. Having been fought to a standstill in Lebanon, they got what they wanted. They got the supply cut off to Hezbollah and to Palestinian resistance in Syria, and the installation of a very weak and dubious regime. While the current civil administration says that they're working with the HTS leaders. Let's remember, HTS is a declared terrorist organization, not just under Anglo-American states, but under UN Security Council, which is not the case with Hamas or Islamic Jihad or Hezbollah, for example. So the universal condemnation of this group is much stronger than it was for any of the resistance groups in the region. So it's going to be difficult to see how, of course, the US will recognize it, because the US and Turkey and the Israelis planned this, basically. There is a source in Washington who said that this HTS assault was planned for the second day after the ceasefire in Lebanon, and specifically to assist the Israelis. And now we see Netanyahu saying, on the one hand, there are tremendous opportunities for the Israelis in this new situation, and indeed Israeli tanks have already crossed over the demarcation line in south of Syria, and it seems like they're ready to go ahead and take advantage of the weak new regime and annex more of Syria, which has always been their goal. Many of them have spoken about taking Damascus. So we don't know where this is going to end, and there's still a number of uncertainties about what happened. But basically, pluralist Syria fell yesterday, and the Western countries are rejoicing about it because they'd always supported these Jabhat al-Nusra HTS terrorists.
Yes, it was so many unanswered questions, and I guess things will get clearer as time passes by. You're right. The timing between the ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah, and then the very next day, all of this starting. Initially, everyone was surprised why the ceasefire took place, and there was lots of theories going around. Hezbollah wasn't really party to that ceasefire, but they just went along with the Lebanese government. So I don't know what the government, Lebanese government, how much they knew at the time what was going on. Secondly, how easily the Syrian forces just kind of just didn't resist at all. And I'm beginning to think, do you think there's a possibility that there was some payoffs for like the top leadership of the Syrian army? I just don't understand what happened there.
Do you want me to start with Lebanon first, or?
Yeah.
So I think, yes, the ceasefire, it's true, was between the Israelis and the Lebanese government, which has a prime minister, Mr. McCarthy, and no president there yet. Hezbollah is part of the government, but they never do any agreements or treaties with the Israelis. They don't recognize the Israelis, and the Israelis don't recognize them. So it's true, in a sense, there was some, from the Hezbollah point of view, the ceasefire between the McCarthy and the Israelis, and I believe the United Nations was involved in some way, was a chance for the Israelis to retreat from the south, where they'd achieved none of their military goals. Effectively, they hadn't taken over a single village. They weren't able to stably occupy a single village in South Lebanon. Of course, they ruled from the air because they had the air power. They could bomb people everywhere. They killed many thousands of people. The Lebanese will never forget that. But on the ground, they made no advances at all. So they had to retreat. It was a humiliation, really, and they were looking for some vindication, some compensation, and really they've got it in terms of Syria. From the Syrian side, I think it's very clear that there was some sort of deal in there, because the army command called back the army first in Aleppo, then Hama, then in Homs. At first they were saying we are repositioning for a counterattack, but it's clear after a while, there was no counterattack. And in the end, the government in Damascus surrendered, and the prime minister, who was appointed by the president Assad, who left the country, the prime minister stayed there to hand over to the HTS terrorists, basically. We still have no idea what sort of government there's going to be, but in the interim, there are these armed groups wandering the streets, shooting almost randomly. There was some order about no reprisals and leaving public buildings alone, and indeed a lot of the public servants seem to be cooperating with the new armed groups. But nevertheless, I have friends in hospital who say the hospitals are full of wounded people. Many people are afraid in their houses because there's shooting and bombing going on outside. So it's a chaotic situation there. And in that chaos, the Israelis have already crossed the demarcate. I don't say border because the Israelis are occupying part of South Syria anyway, the Jolan. And they've been talking about new buffer zones. They're always talking about buffer zones. In occupied Palestine itself, they keep taking land and calling it a buffer zone, basically, if they're not going to use it directly for some purpose. So they are talking now about, they are acting on their talk now about seizing the opportunity with a very weak administration. I believe, actually, they also bombed some of the army facilities, Syrian army facilities, before they went in just recently. They've been constantly hitting air defense in South Syria. They scrambled all the GPS in South Syria for many, many years. So now they are on a ground level. The Israelis are invading Syria in a way that they weren't able to invade Lebanon, basically, because the army has been disarmed effectively. Whether they will be able to rally, whether the HTS gangs are able to get the cooperation of the army to rally against the Israelis remains to be seen. But I think it's rather doubtful, because we all know that the HTS groups are proxies of the US and of NATO and of Mr. Erdogan in Turkey. And Mr. Erdogan in Turkey is working very closely with the Israelis and with the Americans. We know that.
Yes, I think Erdogan is clever. He comes and says one thing to keep the streets happy, and at the same time he does deals with Israelis, sometimes openly, sometimes behind the scenes when it's too embarrassing to do things openly. But when it comes to Jolani, I think, is it right that they've already said that they have no problems with Israel?
Yeah, that's right. There've been many messages from Jolani and his supporters that they have no problems with Israel. They wanted to topple Bashar al-Assad. They've now done that. Nevertheless, the Israelis are happy with that, but of course they don't trust them either. So they will take advantage of the situation as much as they can. But nevertheless, these are proxies acting on behalf of the US, of the NATO states, effectively. If the reports from Washington are true, it was a US Turkish Israeli plan, the HTS assault, and using Turkish weaponry paid for by Qatar. By the way, Qatar has a very important role in this because the
Yes.
Qataris are, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood partners of Mr. Erdogan in Turkey. Now, from the point of view of Erdogan's rhetoric, you're right. There's a lot of double speak there, and that's you have to account for that by the fact that the Turkish people themselves are very sympathetic to the Palestinians. They don't like the fact that Erdogan has been working with the Israelis. Erdogan has been sending oil from Baku in Azerbaijan for some time to the Israelis. He's been the main conduit of fuel to the Israelis during the whole Gaza genocide, and that's a very deeply unpopular thing from the Turkish public point of view, and so Erdogan adjusts his rhetoric for the public there. I saw a video of a young man actually denouncing the Turkish government recently in Turkey, saying that they were sending ships of fuel to the Israelis, during the genocide, and he was arrested and carted away. But that's a sort of a reality of Turkish politics, which the Erdogan regime tries to keep from the Turkish public.
Yes. I was talking to Professor Belal Ozgun from Istanbul yesterday, and it's exactly the kind of things that he kind of clarified as well, that there's been times when, because there's a lot of sympathy in Turkey for, as you say, for Palestinians. So there's a lot of protests going on how Turkey's doing trade deals and everything with Israel. So they had to cancel all of them. But as a result, they just carried on and maybe even doubled it under the table. So everything still kept going on, but now it was just on unofficial basis.
Yes, and of course he also was in the Astana talks with Russia and Iran about Syria, saying all the right words about maintaining the territorial integrity of Syria and so on, while, for at least since about 2019, there have been Turkish troops based in the north of Syria, particularly in northern Idlib, but also northern Aleppo, northern Raqqa countryside. So there have been, and Turkish troops and Turkish proxies up there supporting the HTS group, the Al Qaeda group, and also a group they call the Syrian National Army, which is a oxymoron really, because there's some Syrians in it, but it's really a Turkish proxy basically.
Yeah. Also, you mentioned that there's lots of killing going on the streets, maybe settling scores and things like that. I didn't even know that. So I think that a lot of these things aren't being covered in mainstream media. And actually, American media is kind of working around the clock trying to do the PR job for these HTS people.
Yes, that's true. I've been talking to a lot of friends in Damascus in the last 24 hours, and some of them are okay personally because they're not going to be the targets of a sectarian attack because of their particular religion or religious sect. But nevertheless, they are telling me that some of them are doctors, that the hospitals are full of wounded people, and many of the others, including from all religious sects, are saying that they're afraid, they're staying at home, because there's such uncertainty with people. You see, there's video also coming through on the Telegram channels. You see cars being stopped and then shot at. They've been looting the central bank. There's a lot of looting going on. The borders have been closed, so it's difficult because many people want to escape and they can't. That's a difficult situation. But many people are afraid and staying in their homes at the moment, which is what happened in the past when the Al Qaeda style groups took over their homes, because of course they, you're aware of this phrase takfiri, the takfiri groups. This idea, maybe it's not common in Western circles, but the idea of sectarian terrorism. It has some sort of roots in Salafism, I suppose, that you can attack the person because of their religious sect, basically. They don't need to do anything. But with the HTS and Jabhat al-Nusra, you have this combination of really their main aim is people who support the government. And they don't care if they're Sunni Muslims or Shia Muslims or whatever, but people from minorities, they will attack and they have attacked all the minorities in terrible, gruesome, awful ways, just as every bit as bad as ISIS. There is no real difference in the atrocities that this HTS group has carried out and those that the ISIS terrorist group carried out. And part of it is takfiri terrorism, so you are at great risk if you're a minority or what they consider a kufr, an unbeliever in some way. But also if you work for the government, even I've heard of young boys who went to get a government ID, so they could get some sort of social benefit, and they were shot and killed or wounded for getting a government ID because that was collaboration with the government, So it's a terrible climate there at the moment.
Yeah. Also, I think the big question at the moment on everyone's mind is, how did Russia and Iranian intelligence not see any of this coming?
Well, the information I have from the Iranian side is that they did see it coming. There were some warnings of it. It was being planned for a while. The timing of it, of course, I believe had a lot to do with the ceasefire in Lebanon and the Israelis being desperate for some sort of compensation for their failure in Lebanon. After all, it was a huge failure for Netanyahu to retreat without any noticeable gain from Lebanon. He claimed he was going there to destroy Hezbollah and to allow the settlers to go back to the northern colonies of occupied Palestine and so on. None of that's happened. So the timing of it had a lot to do with the ceasefire and the failure of the Israeli ground invasion. But the planning of an assault like that, another wave, basically, let's remember the Syrian army with Russian support and some Iranian advisors, not really troops, but they had some advisors and they had also some militia from other parts, some from Afghanistan, some from Iraq, from some other parts, but nevertheless not Iranian ground troops. They managed to liberate the bottom third of Idlib and some other parts of northern Syria. But there was a standoff when the Turkish army intervened and the NATO states were threatening to attack Syria. This is like 2019, something like 2019, 2020. And so at that stage, the Russian president intervened because he believed he had an inside channel to the Turkish leadership. And apparently he had also advised Erdogan of the attempted coup against Erdogan in 2016. So he thought he had some capital. He probably does have some capital there. Turkey and Russia have an important strategic economic relationship, ever since because Turkey's a member of NATO, the second biggest NATO army after the US, let's remember, which was also occupying Syria, still occupying parts of Syria. And so Putin said that he was going to try and, get some diplomatic agreement to avoid the possible missile attacks from the NATO partners and the US on Syria. That didn't happen. So effectively there was a freezing of the situation. I went to the borders of the occupied areas a couple of times over, in recent years, and there was no real change in the front lines there. Basically, the army was holding the front lines. The army was confident. The army commanders were confident they could retake Idlib when they had the political direction to do so, basically. But nevertheless, there were many tens of thousands of armed men that had gone there. Remember, they'd taken them out of some of the occupied areas like Aleppo and the east countryside of Damascus and taken them on green buses and rather than kill them, take them up and put them in this holding area. But it was they were protected by Turkish troops, and they were building their capacity. Of course, with Qatari money and Turkish capacity, they gave them lots of vehicles and equipment, and including drones in recent times, which are very important in their recent assault. So the assault was in the making. Iran saw it coming. What I've heard from Iranian sources recently is we don't know the full picture yet, but the Iranian leader some 6 months ago offered more direct support, warned the Syrian president, and offered more direct support there. More recently, the Iranians were offering support, but because the Syrians had made a sort of a breakthrough in terms of getting back into the Arab League and re-establishing relations with some of the Persian Gulf Arab monarchies, or basically the Gulf Council of Cooperation, led by the Saudis with Qataris on the side, because the Qataris and the Saudis fell out. The Saudis are very jealous of the Muslim Brotherhood network, so they don't like Muslim Brotherhood influence in the region. It undermines their importance, basically. But nevertheless, the GCC element, which basically runs the Arab League these days, was trying to discourage the Syrians from becoming too involved with Iran. So that meant that Iran was offering direct troop support for Syria. And the message I'm hearing now is that the President Bashar al-Assad was concerned to not get offside the Arab League. Remember, historically, Syria was one of the founders of the Arab League, and so they still, the ruling party, the Ba'ath Party, was still pan-Arabist and inclined to try and resurrect their role or the role of the Arab League there. And they had some partners like Algeria and others and so on. But nevertheless, it was a breakthrough, an attempt to break the blockade. It didn't really break the economic blockade of Syria, their re-entry to the Arab League, because there wasn't great investment from the Emiratis or any of these others, really. The US blockade was holding, basically, and the Syrians were being starved. And that, of course, helped explain the lack of an appetite on the part of the Syrians to get involved in another serious conflict after years of war and years of starvation, basically. But the story I'm hearing from Iranian sources is that the Iranians offered support, but the Syrian president did not want it, did not ask for it, beyond advisors, basically. And so he didn't ask for serious ground support from Iran. And on the other hand, there was some sort of promises coming from the Arab League side, well, I suppose particularly the Saudis, that if he were to agree to certain conditions, that he could remain as president and they would make some sort of compromises. In the end, whatever the deal was, I think the Syrian president was probably party to it, because the Syrian army is a very disciplined army. Under orders, I've watched them, under orders, they have reconciled with Hamas. When Hamas joined some of the Al-Qaeda groups at one stage, they reconciled with them because they were told to do so. And they are cooperating with the Kurdish groups, the SDF, or Qassad as they're called in Syria. In the areas where there is not a US occupation, they were cooperating with the SDF, who were working to try and partition the country, with US help in part, and in some parts of North Syria without US help. So in other words, they're a disciplined force who do what they're told in those sort of circumstances. I think the Syrian president was misled by some promises from some of the Gulf Cooperation Council's members, like the Saudis, for example. They wouldn't have trusted the Qataris because they knew the Qataris was funding HTS in Idlib. But there were some sort of promises on the Arab League side and some concern to not offend them by having more direct Iranian involvement in Syria. There's a certain amount of groundswell that the comprador Arab states have got by demonizing the Iranians in the region and use it in Syria against the Syrian government too. So I think on that basis, there was some sort of deal. We don't know exactly what was involved in it, but I suspect the president was probably part of it to try and avoid bloodshed, to try and allow, to pull back the troops, allow some sort of compromise. But in the end, it turned into a rout and a complete surrender, basically. And we don't know the details of the deal that was done there, or who, what benefits that might have been for whom as yet.
I also heard that, Iran was suspecting some things kind of brewing. And Iran also tried to convince the Russians that we can't leave this as like a frozen conflict. We need to sort this out. But Russians weren't really prepared, as you say, because they had, they thought that Erdogan, they didn't kind of expect Erdogan's going to do what he did. And they didn't want to stir things up unnecessarily at that point in time.
Well, also, I think the Russians have a few compromises. On the one hand, they have their position with the Israelis is very different to Iran and Syria, basically. From the Iranian-Syrian point of view, the Israelis are the cancer in the region, at the root of all problems. The Russians have a historical compromise with the Israelis. That's one thing. They have a strategic relationship with Turkey. That's another thing. They are seriously distracted by Ukraine and the Black Sea. They know that they've been encircled by NATO. They're involved in that, really. So they offered help and they provided help to the Syrians with air power, with intelligence and so on like that. But their presence on the ground was always very limited. They had some very limited demining and some patrols and things like that, but really they were not deeply involved. A lot of the serious battles in liberating the cities in Syria after 2015 was really done by the Syrian army. That all of the sacrifices done to liberate cities like Harasta and Douma and Khan Sheikhoun and Marat al-Numan. It was the Syrian army that was doing all those things with Russian support from the air and in intelligence, basically. So the Russians, in a sense, were distracted and blindsided. I think Anthony Blinken in the NATO meeting a couple of days before the HTS assault said that, this is the way the North Americans speak often. They're saying HTS took advantage of the fact that Syria's allies, the Iranians, the Russians were, and Hezbollah were distracted. Well, yeah, HTS took advantage of it, but HTS's patrons, the US, Turkey, and Israel took advantage of it, and that accounts for the timing.
Very true. So, in the final analysis for Russia, do you think this is a big loss for Russia, and how do you see what's going to happen if their presence in the Mediterranean Sea and all of that?
I suppose their presence, the naval base in Tartus and the air base in Hamaim are up in the air. They're still there at the moment. I guess they're in play. I don't think they were strategically big things for the Russians, not any more than their strategic relationship with Turkey, for example, which helps explain, I suppose, why the Russians don't want to get involved in a Syrian war against Turkey, for example, because Turkey strategically is helping them escape the blockade that the US is trying to impose on the Russian economy, basically. And it also, because they're a NATO member, it's additionally sweet in that sense, basically. So I don't think that the Tartus base is critical to them. The Russians are not relying on foreign bases, unlike the North Americans. They don't rely on their foreign bases so much. And like I said, they're much more strategically concerned about the Black Sea, about being encircled in the Black Sea and having NATO bases appearing in the Black Sea, which they definitely don't want. And Ukraine, of course, which I managed to see recently. In fact, last month I was in the liberated areas of southeastern Ukraine, and that's a very important struggle for them, and looks like they may have some possibilities to reconcile it to some degree with the Trump administration if Trump has any real independence from the so-called deep state in the US, but that's of most importance strategically for the Russians. I don't think that the naval base in Tartus is actually that big for them. It may even be that the Syrian, whatever new Syrian regime come out of it, may even keep those Russian bases there. Who knows what happens, because we don't know what's going to happen with the Israeli invasion in the south. We don't know how they're going to rebrand a government that is internationally branded as a terrorist group. Not just by the US and the Anglo-Americans, but by the UN Security Council. How they're going to rapidly change that and say this is now a government. So any terrorist group can go to any state which is occupied by three foreign militaries, as Syria was, and say we are the new government, and everyone will recognize you straight away. I don't think that's really going to be very palatable. So I believe that the North Americans in particular will be doing a lot of rebranding at the moment. They're good at that. That's their specialty, more or less. That's what they do. And indeed, there's a story in the New York Times. I didn't read it, but I saw the headline just recently saying that the Syrians have to thank the Israelis for their liberation. So this is just as the Israelis are invading them, as they've got throat-cutting terrorists in Damascus running riot, and as the Israelis are invading from the south, the Syrians are supposed to be, according to the New York Times, to thank the genocidal Israelis who've been killing their Palestinian brothers and sisters, for the last 14 months. They've got to thank the Israelis. So that's sort of the crude spin that's been put out in the New York Times at the moment. But there'll be much more of that, because they won't be able to say it's an HTS government. They'll have to call it something else. Even you recall in Egypt when the Muslim Brotherhood took over, because the Muslim Brotherhood was a banned terrorist organization in Egypt, they couldn't call, what was his name, Morsi, a Muslim Brotherhood candidate. They had to create some other party for him to be appointed president. So they'll have to create some new organization, a coalition of, unified Syrian democratic forces or some such rubbish, basically, to paper over the fact that you've got a serious NATO proxy who is calling the shots in Damascus now, which sadly.
I am surprised that Biden, if you look at his track record throughout his term as president, it was awful. And somehow in the last month, he's pulled this off, where probably his team's pulled it off. So it's a big surprise. And I think you're right. In some ways, it's going to, I thought in some ways it's going to give Trump a big bargaining chip as soon as he comes into the office, because before I was thinking, how is Trump ever going to be able to negotiate any kind of a end of the conflict in Ukraine with Russia? But now Trump, as soon as he gets in, he's going to have this big bargaining chip.
Well, I don't think it's a bargaining chip with the Russians, really. The Russians know where their interests are, and that's their borders, and the Russian people were being attacked in southeast Ukraine and Crimea, of course. But I don't think it's a bargaining chip for Trump so much. I think if we look at Erdogan, yes, Erdogan might have wanted a bargaining chip with Trump. In other words, if he is effectively, you know, the overlord of large parts, if not all, of Syria. We don't know what's going to happen to the coast yet, of course. The government surrendered, so it seems like the whole government has collapsed. But nevertheless, there may be some pockets of resistance there. We're not sure about that yet. But Erdogan has been boasting, and some of his followers have been boasting that now, you know, they've got Aleppo back. Aleppo was historically, you know, part of the Ottoman Empire and so on, and therefore Turkish, which is not the same thing, of course. You know, this whole continuity or lack of continuity between Turkish nationalism and the Ottoman period is an interesting story. But nevertheless, there are a lot of noises in Turkey, not just from Erdogan, about some historic claims to northern Syria, basically, and the great commercial hub that Aleppo was, for example. So in that context, it may be that Erdogan thinks he's got some bargaining chip. If his proxies are now in Damascus, as well as Aleppo, then maybe he's going to try and do some deal with Trump. Maybe that's in Erdogan's mind. I think that's more likely. I don't think it was any great cleverness on Biden's part that this happened. It was really the things that were in train, the deep state processes that were in train in the US. They had all of their agents on the ground. They had their, of course, principal agent, which is the Israelis, basically, which is effectively an outpost of the US in the region, not really independent in any real sense. But with an important influence on the whole US apparatus, basically. So the Israelis, as I said, they wanted compensation. They wanted some vindication from their rather humiliating defeat in Lebanon. They could kill a lot of people, but not take any ground in South Lebanon. And they had spectacular success. Really, I wrote in an article just come out yesterday that this is a great reward for genocide. You know, they instead of being punished for the genocide, they've been rewarded for it by now. What they always wanted to break the key link in the chain of the axis of resistance, you know, between Iran and Hezbollah and Iran and the Palestinian resistance, and that was Syria. A lot of people didn't understand that important role that Syria was playing, of course, for Palestine. Maybe they understood a little bit more for Hezbollah, but really it was because the Syrians were effectively had their hands tied during the genocide in Gaza. They were still providing weapons to Hezbollah and to the Palestinian resistance, but because they were occupied by the two biggest NATO armies and by the Israelis, it's very difficult for them to open a new front, a new war front, and certainly the Syrian president was reluctant to open a new front.
I think at the moment the Western NATO Turkish alliance, they're gleeful and they're celebrating, but personally speaking, I don't see all of this going as smoothly as they think it's going to go. I think maybe in a month, 2 months time, it's all going to kick off. It's going to turn into a bit like Afghanistan, because there's so many, maybe even worse than Afghanistan, because there's so many regional powers that all want to have their own influence in the area. Because I remember Morsi, who replaced what was the Hosni Mubarak. He was supporting some of these people because of their links to the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah.
And Saudi Arabia, as you say, doesn't like the Muslim Brotherhood and wanted none of it, didn't want to have a Muslim Brotherhood government sitting in Egypt. So he supported the coup, and now we have in Egypt what we have. So I can see lots of countries. Iraq is going to play a part, Saudi Arabia. And there's so many of these groups, and they don't really get along with each other. So we'll see what happens, but I think it's all going to kick off.
Yes, it's unstable. We're entering or the West Asia is entering an unstable period. There's no doubt about that. Of course, Iraq has the beginnings of some new independent political will, but they are still occupied by the US and very weakened by that. I've seen myself personally earlier this year some of the damage that's been done of US occupation there in practical ways and in cultural ways too, you know. So, but nevertheless, Iraq has an important role. The Iraqis, some of the Iraqis, because, you know, there's a popular mobilization group within the government and outside the government, you know, which is a little complicated, but they are coordinating with the Yemenis now in attacking the Israelis, you know, so there is still an axis of resistance working there effectively. Of course, they are also supported by Iran, you know, that to some extent the Yemenis and to a large extent the Iraqis. So they are involved in the regional resistance against the Israelis at the moment. So that hasn't disappeared. But as you say, the NATO groups and the Israelis are jubilant by the fact that they've been able to knock out one important key link. I think you know, even CNN is recognizing that this was Syria was such an important hub for the resistance countries, or what they call the Iranian proxies, or whatever they want to call them, you know, in the region. That really the Israelis are jubilant, and their sponsors in Europe are jubilant. But as you say, there's a counter movement. There's always a counter movement there. The resistance hasn't disappeared entirely. The Yemenis have faced up to direct attacks from the Anglo-Americans. They've effectively driven the Anglo-Americans out of the Red Sea there. Incredible resilience, incredible capacity. I believe from sources that this is where the US is very dangerous. We're in a period where they are losing their grip on the world. They know they're losing their grip, and they're becoming more dangerous with these hybrid wars. You know, they're expanding them. I believe I'm hearing signs that the so-called Southern Front, which is backed by the Emiratis and the Saudis and the US in Aden, are going to try and reopen the war in Yemen too, which it's been quiet for about 3 years, and that's allowed the Ansarullah-led government in Sana'a to do these to carry out a blockade on the Red Sea on the Israelis and to launch missiles at them and so on. But I believe that there's going to be a reopening of that front also. And of course, the US has never reconciled to the independent popular mobilization groups in Iraq. You know, there'll be more conflict there basically, and perhaps some more direct conflict with Iran. We don't know. So the US, a determination to hang on to their role in the world. I mean, exemplified by Ukraine too, really. And why are so many young Ukrainian men dying? You know, simply to divide Russia from Ukraine, you know, where there used to be one person there, and virtually everyone in Ukraine speaks Russian. Now they ban Russian language and so on. Where did this all come from? To drive a wedge between Ukraine and Russia, and then it split their church, you know. So all of this was really only to serve the interests of the US, to try and dominate the Europeans and to try and divide Russia from the Europeans. They've had some success in that, but it's causing incredible pain, you know, and particularly I met some young Ukrainian men who defected from their military when I was in the city of Donetsk, and they were cooperating with the Russians against the Kiev forces because they were so concerned about all of these young Ukrainian men being sacrificed at the altar of trying to divide Ukraine from the Russian people just for the benefit of the US, basically, which orchestrated that coup in Kiev back in 2014. That's really when the current war started. So the US is dangerous with all of these sorts of wars, but nevertheless, it sparked resistance, and Syria was a great defeat. But as you say, there's going to be other remobilizations of resistance to these proxy wars.
Yeah, that's the thing. Everything that happens in West Asia, everything has like a knock-on effect, a butterfly effect, or whatever you may call it. When I was talking to Professor Bellol yesterday, he was saying that what's happened in Syria is kind of a direct result of the attacks by Hamas in October last year. But I think what's happened in Syria is going to have so many knock-on effects on other countries. So I was trying to think, like, it's hard to predict what's going to happen, but the balance of power is starting to shift in the region. And it's going to, because we're just getting to a stage where things between Saudi Arabia and Iran were kind of stabilizing. As you say, the conflict with Yemen was stopped, and things were kind of getting to a certain balanced state. And now I think this is going to put so many pressures on so many people, so many countries. And in all of that, I think they're kind of really inflating this whole Shia Sunni thing, which is kind of going to make things even worse in the whole region.
Well, that was an invention of the Pentagon, effectively. You know, they weaponized that one. And there'd been some historical differences, but it wasn't weaponized in the way it had since the Iranian Revolution, basically. That since 1979, that whole thing was used as a tool. They toyed with the idea of Arab Persian things, and they came up with this idea that they could weaponize the Sunni Shia thing, which worked to a degree in Syria for a while, but it was cancelled effectively by the insurrection in Gaza. You know, the fact that the Shia bloc was seen as the major supporters of all of the Palestinian resistance groups, who are all Sunni Muslims. Not all of them are Islamists, but nevertheless, there was hardly any Shia Muslims in Palestine anywhere, and people saw that that was that Hezbollah and Iran were supporting Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas and Popular Front, the non-Islamist ones also. So that really changed things for a while in Lebanon, for example. So the Sunni bloc in Lebanon, and Lebanon is the most formally sectarianized state in the region. Basically, everyone has to, you've got your religion on your sleeve, on your ID card, basically. That's the level of it. But those who had, for example, supported the sectarian terrorists in Syria were now supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon because because Hezbollah was supporting Gaza. And for more than a year, drawing the fire away from Gaza, sacrificing a lot of their young men, and tremendous heroic sacrifices, of giving their lives to draw the heat away from Gaza at a time when the genocide was being carried out, basically. And then eventually, of course, it came onto Lebanon, and then, of course, the North Americans tried to use their proxies in Lebanon to blame Hezbollah for the Israeli bombing and the Israeli invasion. But nevertheless, some of the factions that were divided over the dirty war in Syria came together with the Gaza insurrection because they saw so clearly that the Shia bloc was supporting the Palestinian resistance. So now, as you say, that may be reopened, although we're going to see the ugly side of the Takfiri terrorism in Syria, and to what extent they can cooperate with any other forces in Syria remains to be seen. To what extent they're going to They've already ransacked the Iranian embassy in Damascus. They did that yesterday. The same embassy that was bombed by the Israelis. So people are going to see in the whole region, let alone the world, the collaboration between this destruction of Syria and the Israelis, basically. And at the same time, the Israelis are invading the country. And who's going to defend Syria's borders from the Israelis, basically? What sort of deals are going to be cut there? That's going to send a lot of messages to people in the region, basically, which is most important, because actually the resistance is mainly local and regional. What you and I think on the other side of the world matters much less. We just try and help other people understand it. But how the masses see it in the region is very important. That they can be fooled. They are fooled. I mean, I've seen this. The US has been trying to poison people's minds against the Iranians, because they're not Arabs, and because they're Shia and so on like that. And it's worked to a degree, but the thing is, it works in a certain context, and then the context changes. Like the Gaza insurrection comes along, and all of a sudden everything's thrown up in the air and people have to rethink things. I mean, regionally, basically. So Syria is going to have a similar sort of effect to the Gaza insurrection, in another way, basically. That's going to be it is another tragedy. We're going to see a lot of bloodshed, unfortunately. I've got a lot of friends who are still trying to escape the country now because either because of their sect or because they are identified with the government, basically. And so we're going to see how that plays out, even though important government agencies are now cooperating with the new regime. The new regime will have to be rebadged. How that works, whether they can defend the country, whether they can lift the economic blockade, which has been starving the Syrians for a long time now. There's been some of the worst impact of this war has been the economic blockade that's been imposed on Syria. Is that going to change with this new regime? So there's a lot of things up in the air. But as you mentioned before, you've got thesis and antithesis here. You've got the US wanting to hang on to its role in the region, and you've got resistance to that those what I call wars of hegemonic decline. That they are erupting everywhere. We've got more proxy wars around the world than we have had in living memory, basically. But you've also got resistance springing up around the world, and you've got some very interesting cross-continental collaborations. We're going to talk later on, I think, about Venezuela, maybe some other time. But the collaboration between Venezuela and Iran, and Venezuela and Palestine, Venezuela and Syria, for example, is important because, of course, the US is trying to target Venezuela again. But Venezuela's economy is recovering because of BRICS, and BRICS has introduced a new factor into things. Not just BRICS, but the fact that there are alternative economic relationships opening up. You see Trump threatening the BRICS members with if they try and escape the use of the dollar, but half the BRICS members are already under sanctions and banned from using the dollar. So it's a strange sort of threat. But that has opened up new possibilities of resistance, and including economic resistance.
Let me just take a moment's break to introduce our sponsors for today. This episode is proudly being sponsored by the Worldwide Listings Company Limited, or WLC for short. WLC is a e-commerce marketing agency specializing in making brands successful on Amazon. So if you are thinking of starting a new venture, or if you already have a brand and you want to take it to that next level, then get in touch and WLC will be able to help. For transparency purposes, let me also tell you that WLC is actually a company that I founded and am the director of. When you get in touch with WLC, you'll be getting in touch with me and my team, and we look forward to greeting you and seeing how we can help. Thank you, and now let's get back to the episode. How do you see this whole rebranding of Julani and the kind of rebranding for HTS? The people who are saying that this new kind of face of Julani, where he's talking about like a different ideology, that this isn't something that he's just come up with now. This is something that he's now been talking about for about 8 years. So do you think, do you actually see any change there, or do you think it's all PR?
Look, the US has been doing that for him for some time. I think PBS did it some years ago. CNN did it just a couple of days ago. Of course, even though there's a $10 million reward in the US for him from the FBI or some such thing, because he's branded, he personally and HTS are branded as terrorists under US law as well as international law. As I said, Hamas is not branded as a terrorist organization under international law, but HTS is. Okay, so that's an important legitimacy problem that they have, basically. However they try and whitewash him on, put him in a suit and put him on PBS or CNN. But the Syrians, for their part, they recall that the role of his role, and he was in ISIS at one stage, Jabhat al-Nusra at another stage, now he's in HTS. They recall the worst sectarian atrocities. As I said, Takfiri terrorism against people because of their religious sect, but also because of their affiliation with the government. If you were Sunni Muslim, it didn't help you. If you were seen in some way linked to the government, they would murder you, or they would slice you up. There were these horrific attacks that all the Syrians are aware of, and there are stories of people committing suicide and killing their families so that their families aren't sliced up and raped and so on. So the Syrians don't buy this stuff. It's being put out there for the benefit of the US, obviously, mainly to try and maintain some sort of consistency with the government and keep the level of protest down. They were hurt, but the Biden administration, of course, knew that it was hurt, and maybe even lost the election over the genocide in Gaza, because it shifted at least a solid % of people and young people into not voting for them or going for a third party, for example, even though we know that Trump in substance isn't much better, basically. But nevertheless, Kamala Harris lost a lot of vote because of the Gaza genocide. So there is some fear of that alienating US public opinion. They don't really care too much about public opinion in other countries, but the Anglosphere is important to them, and the US opinion is important to them. So they're going to try and rebrand it, but I don't think they can really put up Julani as a president. They also have got, the Russians are pulling this card now. They've got this old UN Security Council resolution from 2015. There is no military solution. There has to be a new constitution, free and fair elections, so on and so on. territorial integrity, blah, blah, blah. All of those things which are selectively picked on by different players over the years. Now it has new relevance in the current circumstances, because Syria is still occupied. Why is the US occupying Syria if they're going to have free and fair elections, territorial integrity, blah, blah, blah? The excuse before was that Bashar al-Assad was a brutal dictator killing his own people and so on. Really, I think that Bashar al-Assad was probably deeply involved with this collapse and trying to save further bloodshed, actually, for better or for worse. I mean, it's true that not a lot of people were killed in the takeover, but now that the takeover is there, I don't think it's that easy. I think they have to do something like the Egyptian case. They have to at least call in some new coalition, create some new coalition, get some collaborators who are in the civil administration of Assad's administration, effectively, and in the civil service, which they need anyway, because they're sitting in northern Idlib, firing rockets at the Syrian army. It's not really good preparation for being a government. The Western media call them opposition, but they're not really an opposition. They don't really have any civil experience or not much civil experience. So they need collaborators. They'll get them because people want to save their skin. Two, because there's a lot of changelings who'll do it, or they want to maintain public services. They'll get the people in. I believe, for example, the flag of HTS is already, or some modified flag is being flown on some of the ministries already. The tourism ministry and maybe the health. The people in health want to do their work. So they will get some level of collaboration. They will have to talk about elections and so on. They'll create some transitional administration. Even the transitional administration, I think they will have to rebadge. That it's they've tried hard with Jolani, but the Syrians are really are not going to buy it as some sort of democratic option, because there's a lot of history there, and there's a lot of people who are in danger now. Actually, there's a lot of people arming themselves, like individually, to protect themselves and their families at the moment, because there are these young men roaming the streets, shooting in the air and so on. Even though the Jolani himself has made calls for calm and not to attack public buildings. I think they burnt some of the public buildings, but he's saying not to carry out reprisals, but they're going to hold accountable the people that carried out war crimes and so on. So there's ominous things there, and people are very insecure there. So we can't say with certainty, what's happening there.
Yeah, I've also heard that Israel is going to want to see if they can, with this friendly government that they put in place in Syria, if they can do some deal on the Golan Heights to kind of end that whole. Do you think this, whatever comes out of this, it will have enough legitimacy to be able to do that deal with Syria? With Israel.
Well, first of all, they've already invaded. They've gone beyond the occupied Golan. They've gone into Quneitra, which is in the so-called buffer zone. The Israelis are themselves talking about a buffer zone. They want a buffer zone for their buffer zone. That's how they extend their territory in Palestine. It's how they're doing it in Syria, basically. Do they want the new regime to legitimize their annexation of the Golan and maybe their annexation of Quneitra and maybe Daraa? Who knows? I don't know. And I don't think that any transitional regime would have the authority to do that, basically. If they're going to try and integrate the new HTS-led regime with the UN Security Council Resolution 2254, I think it is, they're going to need to talk about a new constitution as well as new elections. So that remains to be seen. I don't think, short of an elected, a new constitution, new elected government, I don't think they can just simply get a group that's actually universally recognized as a terrorist group to authorize their annexation. Trump tried to do it, but that didn't really. Then Biden reversed that, and international law hasn't changed on that, basically, on the Golan. So I don't think they can do it in a rush. But what they can do in a rush is invade, and they've done it already. And I think they want more than the Golan, basically. Some of them talking about they want Damascus, so who knows what they want. There's no limit to it. There are Israeli soldiers out there with a map of the new Greater Israel, which includes almost all of Syria, From the brook of Egypt to the Euphrates, and is what the expression of Herzl was basically. So everywhere from the Nile to the Euphrates was potentially Greater Israel, and one of the ministers, Smotrich, has been talking about that. He wants, Damascus is ours basically. So they may move on Damascus very soon. Who knows?
Wow. How do you see the future of Hezbollah being affected by what's happened? Do you think this is like a kind of a deadly blow for them?
Not a very dangerous blow, but not necessarily a knockout blow. It's very dangerous. They've clearly been weakened. Syria was an incredible support for Hezbollah and for the Palestinian resistance. Hezbollah and Hamas and all of the other Palestinian factions on the West Bank and in Gaza. Syria was very important, and independent Syria was very important for them. The HTS group done nothing for Palestine. They never attacked the Israelis. They never did anything. On the contrary, the Israelis took them into hospitals and patched them up. And then when they were being defeated in the South Syria in 2018, they bailed them out. They took them into Israeli territory and helped them escape, basically. So there's no indication that the HTS is going to help the Palestinians, let alone Hezbollah. Many of them were celebrating the fact that the Israelis had killed Hassan Nasrallah, for example, which was a terrible blow to the people who supported the resistance in Lebanon. So I think Hezbollah is weakened, but not out, because it's tremendously coherent. You see, after the death of Nasrallah, still they increased their attacks on the Israelis in support of Gaza largely, and then of course, even after the ceasefire, they were trying to enforce the retreat of the Israelis by hitting them, particularly in the parts of Lebanon that are still occupied, because as well as the Golan, you've got some parts of southern Lebanon that are still occupied by the Israelis, they were the first targets of Hezbollah back on the 8th of October last year. So Hezbollah is weakened, but it has a big arsenal there already. It's going to be resupplied by Iran in some ways, but it's definitely weakened. It's undermined. The Israelis have gained substantially. They've been rewarded substantially by this regime change in Damascus, basically. But Hezbollah is down, but not out. That's what I'd say.
Because going forward in the longer term, how is Iran going to be able to supply Hezbollah without that link of? Is it going to have to be from the sea, or?
Well, they've been sending shipping to Syria and fuel to Syria, in fact, there was a tanker that just did a U-turn apparently. I don't know, in the Red Sea, I don't think you can do U-turns in the Suez Canal, but it was heading for the Suez Canal, did a U-turn because with the change of regime in Syria, they're less likely to help the Syrians. So where the Syrians are going to get their fuel from is an interesting question, because at the moment, the US is stealing the fuel in the northeast. Maybe the US is going to withdraw its occupation from the northeast, and from the east. That remains to be seen. We don't know what's happening in Deir ez-Zor, for example. But the Iranians were supporting Hezbollah from the sea also, and from the air to some extent. They did bring in some supplies from the air, although the Israelis were threatening that, and they threatened the shipping. But I think the Iranians were able to protect their own shipping.
Yeah. Okay. Before we end, I just wanted to. There's still some questions left for me for Turkey, so let's just kind of go through that. So, how do you see America's support for the Kurdish people? Is America going to try? USA going to try and give Kurdish people some kind of independence, which Turkey is not going to tolerate? And how is that Turkey supports?
No, I think that game changes now. The
US are they going to throw the Kurd under the bus?
Sorry?
Are they going to throw the Kurd under the bus?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I think the former US ambassador to Syria, what's his name, Robert Ford, told them that. Years ago, he said, don't trust us, don't rely on us. The faction of separatist Kurds in Syria is the smallest of all in the region, really. The big faction is in Turkey, of course. In Turkey, they've got their own logic, because the Kurds did pretty well under the Ottomans, but under Turkish nationalism, they have been treated much less favorably, basically. But the idea of having a Kurdish enclave, a Kurdish separatist statelet in Syria, was always a springboard for the Turkish operation, and the leadership of the Syrian separatists has always been Turkish. Erdogan is right to say that it's a PKK-led operation in Syria. Basically, it's the Turkish leadership is running things there. They were supported by the US and by the Israelis in Erbil in northern Iraq, which is another problem for Iraq. Really, the Federation of Iraq weakened Iraq substantially and didn't stop some of the Kurds, the Barzani Kurds, trying to succeed completely from Iraq a few years ago, but that was crushed, that was put down basically. But really, the US support for this, what they call the Syrian Democratic Forces, what used to be called the YPG, it's still a Kurdish-run operation, although the US tried to paint it as something more, because in most of the areas that they have some influence, Kurds are a minority, in some cases a tiny minority. In Deir ez-Zor, there are very few Kurds. In Manbij, very few Kurds, Even in Kamishli and Hasakeh, really they've always been a minority there, basically. And you've got Arab tribes and various Christian groups, including the Assyrians, have been substantial populations there too. They've tried to disenfranchise them to some degree. But I think that the US will drop this Kurdish separatist thing in Syria now that they've got rid of Assad. I think that's the end of it for them, really. That mainly they were worried about abandoning them and having a power vacuum filled by Iran. That's the message I get, basically. Even they weren't so concerned about the Russians being there as the Iranians being there. That was their concern, that if the US pulled out of Iraq and Syria, that Iran would fill that so-called power vacuum. That's the way they look at it, more or less. So I don't think they've got any interest in the Kurdish separatist state. Of course, it's going to create problems for Turkey. Of course, Erdogan's going to protest. That's been a route of conflict between Erdogan and the US there. But nevertheless, they cooperated on the HTS takeover of Syria. And now Erdogan has a card to play with any US administration, i.e. probably Trump, to see that the US is going to liquidate the Kurdish separatism in Syria, which poses a threat to Turkey, basically, in exchange for whatever, but then Erdogan will try and perhaps keep his, caliphate ideas or domination of parts of northern Syria, and the US will dismantle the SDF. I think the US will dismantle the SDF very quickly, basically. It was only there as a tool to be used against an independent Syrian state. When we say Assad, really, of course, it wasn't just one man. It was Assad represented an independent state that was constitutionally pluralist, that supported the minorities as well as the majority, and was not going to do a deal with the Israelis, basically. That is now gone. And so a lot of the rationale for the US occupying Syria is now gone. And I'm sure that they will throw the separatist Kurds under the bus. Mind you, many of the Kurds had supported, had been indeed leaders of a unified Syria, going back to Saladin. Saladin was a Kurdish man, but he wasn't a Kurdish separatist. He was a great caliph. And then Muhammad al-Bouti, many important religious and political leaders were Kurdish in Syrian history, but most of them were not wanting a separate Kurdish state. They wanted a greater community, a greater ummah,
Yeah. And also, I was reading an interesting article titled, Erdogan backstabs his way into the center of Middle Eastern politics, which is like a really good title, basically. But with Erdogan having done what he has done, how do you think, or do you think that's going to impact his standing in the BRICS?
Well, the BRICS, it's interesting because on the one hand, the Russians want him strategically for themselves. On the other hand, they don't want, and they like the idea of splitting off a NATO member from NATO to be in BRICS. On the other hand, I think one of the key conditions of BRICS membership, and they're reconsidering that now, they in the recent meeting in Kazan, they allowed some associate members to join, but not full members to join. And I think that the criteria for membership are going to include a criteria that's important to the Russians, at least, that BRICS members can't impose third-party sanctions on other BRICS members. So they will have to reject the US unilateral sanctions, which are almost all of the US so-called sanctions are unilateral coercive measures, illegal under international law. But the US has third-party provisions where they coerce their collaborators to enforce. For example, the Emiratis, they're a member of BRICS now, the UAE, but they were coerced to recognize the Israelis some years back because they'd recognized Damascus, so any US administration has this tool with which to hit any of its so-called allies if they're not acting to enforce their third-party sanctions against Iran or Syria or Cuba or Venezuela or whoever it is, basically. So that's going to be a dilemma for Turkey. They won't be able to cooperate with NATO in the same way if they want to be a member of BRICS. But nevertheless, you've got countries that have, Iran has strategic relations with Russia and China and is now a member of BRICS. But there are some other countries like Venezuela has been blocked temporarily, at least by Brazil, but they have strategic relations with Russia and China too, So Turkey will continue to be important for Russia, I believe, and perhaps China. But I think BRICS is going to come up with a rule that they can't really adopt these US. In other words, they'll have to actively reject the US demands for third-party sanctions, and that's going to be a difficult choice for some of them because it'll mean they'll have to stand up to the US. And there are many countries who'd like to be a member of BRICS without standing up to the US. The Southeast Asian countries would like to have done that, but actually they're virtually all associate members of BRICS now, for example. But and they've got good relations with Russia, but they would prefer to do that without standing up to the US. I mean, that's a common thing. I think they like perhaps seeing Russia standing up to the US, but they don't want to do it themselves. That's often something you see in international politics.
Yeah, I think if they can put that rule in, I think that's a really important rule. It will eventually help all the BRIC nations because they're all, to some degree or the other, either affected by sanctions or threatened by sanctions. So it should help them all. I was also asking Professor Bello yesterday how Erdogan and Turkey sees like such a kind of takfiri terrorist government being formed right next to them, and how do you see kind of living in that kind of a condition going forward? How is that going to benefit Turkey? And he was laughing a little bit because he was saying ultimately Erdogan doesn't really care about that. All he cares about is the big contracts that potentially will come out of Syria. And they're already kind of looking into construction contracts and things like that, which is what they kind of see coming out of it.
Yeah, I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood is basically a network of businessmen, Sunni Muslim businessmen, that secret society that share their links, basically. And the Erdogan and his family are deeply involved in this business, of course, that including the business with the Israelis. At a time, it looked like when there was a Muslim Brotherhood president of Egypt, it looked like they were on a roll. Now things are a little bit different, but nevertheless, they've scored a victory now. They have. It's true that the Muslim Brotherhood was more important in supporting HTS than the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia. So in that sense, they've got what they wanted there. Has there been blowback in Turkey? Yes, there's been some terrorism in Turkey too, but particularly if they think they're being betrayed, if these groups think they're being betrayed, and of course because they're going to be betrayed and robbed by their leadership. A lot of the factions in Syria that sought the leaders of the factions in Syria, like Jaish al-Islam and so on, that sought refuge in Turkey. They took the money that was provided by their sponsors, there and left the members high and dry, and then the members had to work out their own solutions with the Syrians, basically. But now I guess there's a bigger pie to go around. They can plunder Syria, and they can share this. And Erdogan, of course, if you're in the Muslim Brotherhood, that you're using terrorism as a tool in West Asia, at least. Maybe in Southeast Asia it's a little bit different, but it can come back to bite you, basically. And this is what Assad always said, that these things can't be completely controlled. But nevertheless, so long as their terrorists are pointed at someone else. Someone's trying to ring me, sorry. As long as they're trying to ring someone, as long as they're trying to kill someone else, then you've got to keep your control over them. That's why I think there were so many different factions in Syria, these armed groups. There were so many different factions because they all had different sponsors. At one time, each of the different Persian Gulf Arab monarchies had their own favorite faction that was sort of fighting there to keep their own influence and so on. After a while, it posed a threat to them. You would notice now that in Saudi Arabia and in the Emirates, the Muslim Brotherhood is banned, Al-Qaeda is banned. If they support these groups as in some other country, it's not for their country, basically. So they don't want them at home. Erdogan will treat them very differently at home. He'll need, his strong state and his history of jailing political opponents, but he will treat them very differently at home to the way he treats them in Syria.
Tim, thank you so much.
Welcome.
Thank you for clarifying a lot of these kind of questions and areas, but also
so many questions up in the air we don't know the answers
exactly to. But before we started this interview, I was really depressed, thinking obviously what's happened in Syria is terrible, but I was thinking as a result it's going to be a death blow for Hezbollah, which as a knock-on effect is going to be a death blow for the Palestinians. But it's good to know that you don't think that's the case. Obviously things are difficult, but it's not like
it's not the end of the resistance. No.
Yeah, that's really good to know. Thank you so much. And as you said, let's catch up together again and we can talk about Venezuela, because I'm really interested to hear more about that.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks. Take care. Bye.